The frozen moon of Arcturus VII had never witnessed such violence. Above its crystalline surface, the Battle of Epsilon Rift raged among the stars. 1,000 ships locked in deadly combat, their energy weapons painting the void in brilliant streaks of destruction. Princess Kythera pressed her pale green fingers against the viewport of her diplomatic vessel, watching her escort fighters fall one by one to the human fleet's relentless assault. "Your Highness, we must evacuate, Captain." Jorek's voice cracked through the ship's failing communication system. The vessel shuddered as another blast tore through its hull, sending the princess stumbling against the bulkhead. Kythera's crimson hair whipped around her shoulders as she steadied herself. Despite the chaos, her violet eyes remained calm, trait inherited from generations of Zephyrian royalty. "The peace negotiations are over." Jorek cut her off as explosions bloomed outside. "The humans rejected our terms. They want total surrender or total war." The ship lurched violently, throwing Kythera to her knees. Through the transparent metal floor, she could see the moon's surface rushing up to meet them. This was not how she'd imagined her first diplomatic mission would end. 300 kilometers away, human engineer Davin Thorne was having his own crisis. His escape pod tumbled through the thin atmosphere like a broken toy, its heat shields failing and emergency power flickering. He'd been running supplies to the human battleships when the Zephyrian counterattack had caught them off guard. Now, as his pod's computer counted down to impact, he could only grip his restraints and pray to whatever gods might be listening. The two crashes happened within minutes of each other. Kythera's diplomatic vessel carved a burning scar across the moon's ice plains before embedding itself in a glacier wall. The princess barely managed to seal herself in the ship's emergency chamber before the hull cracked open like an egg, spilling atmosphere and heat into the merciless cold. Davin's pod hit softer snow but with bone-jarring force. He crawled from the wreckage with a dislocated shoulder and bleeding scalp, his breath forming instant clouds in the sub-zero air. His survival training kicked in immediately. Shelter, warmth, water, food. He had maybe 6 hours before the cold killed him. It was the smoke that led him to her. Following the dark plume rising from the glacier, Davin trudged through knee-deep snow until he found the alien ship's remains. His first instinct was to turn away. Humans and Zephyrians were at war after all. But then he heard something that transcended species. The sound of someone in pain. He found her in what remained of the emergency chamber, curled in a pool of her own green blood. Her pale skin had taken on a bluish tint from the cold, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. For a moment, Davin simply stared. He'd never seen a Zephyrian up close before. Despite everything, the war, the hatred, the propaganda, she was undeniably beautiful, and she was dying. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" Kythera's violet eyes fluttered open, focusing on the strange face above her. Human. The enemy. She should have been afraid, should have reached for the ceremonial blade at her side. Instead, she found herself staring into the kindest brown eyes she'd ever seen. "I'm going to help you," Davin said, though he doubted she understood. He stripped off his thermal jacket and wrapped it around her shivering form. "We need to get you warm." Using materials from both crash sites, Davin worked through the night to build a shelter in the lee of the glacier. He used the pod's emergency heater, the ship's intact power cells, and every piece of insulation he could salvage. When Kythera's fever spiked, he held her close, sharing his body heat. When she whispered words in her alien tongue, he whispered, back in his own, hoping his tone would convey what his words could not. By dawn, they were both still alive. It was a start. 3 weeks had passed since the crash, and their shelter had evolved from desperate improvisation to careful engineering. Davin had connected the ship's remaining power cells to his pod's life support systems, creating a warm pocket of survival in the endless ice. The space was cramped, barely large enough for 2 people to lie down, but it was theirs. Kythera's wounds had begun to heal, though angry scars now traced across her pale green shoulder where shrapnel had torn through her. Diplomatic robes, She sat cross-legged on the makeshift bed they shared, watching Davin repair a water reclamation unit with tools scavenged from her ship. "Kithara," she said suddenly, pressing her hand to her chest. Davin looked up from his work, oil smudged across his cheek. "What?" She repeated the gesture, then pointed at him with a questioning tilt of her head. "Oh." Understanding dawned on his face. "Davin." He touched his own chest, then hers. "Kithara." Her name felt strange on his tongue, all soft consonants and musical vowels. When she smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, something warm unfurled in his chest that had nothing to do with the heater. Their days developed a rhythm. Mornings were for maintenance, checking seals, monitoring power levels, melting ice for water. Kithara proved surprisingly adept with technology once she understood the human systems. Her long, graceful fingers could reach components that Davin's larger hands couldn't access. Afternoons were for language. They sat facing each other, pointing at objects and repeating words until their mouths could shape unfamiliar sounds. Davin learned that Vash meant water and Keth meant fire. Kithara discovered that humans had dozens of words for cold, all of which seemed inadequate for their current situation. But it was the evenings that changed everything. On the 22nd night, Kithara's fever returned. She shivered uncontrollably, despite the shelter's warmth, her skin burning to the touch. Davin had seen this before, infection from her partially healed wounds. "Hey, let me see," he said gently, reaching for the torn fabric covering her shoulder. She flinched away, modesty warring with necessity. In Zephyrian culture, showing skin to a stranger was deeply intimate, but Davin's eyes held no hunger, only concern. "Please," he whispered. "Let me help." Slowly, she allowed him to peel back the makeshift bandage. The wound had reopened, green blood seeping from inflamed edges. Davin cleaned it carefully with their precious supply of medical alcohol, his touch feather-light as she bit back cries of pain. "I'm sorry," he murmured, though she didn't understand the words. "I'm so sorry." When he finished, neither of them moved away. His hands remained on her shoulders, steadying her. Her violet eyes searched his face, seeing past the stubble and exhaustion to something deeper. "Davin," she whispered, and the way she said his name made his heart skip. "Kithara." The kiss happened without conscious thought. Her lips were softer than he'd imagined, tasting of the sweet fruit paste from her ship's emergency rations. She made a small sound of surprise, then melted against him, her hands fisting in his thermal shirt. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Is this?" he began, then switched to the few Zephyrian words he knew. "Kithara? Good?" She answered by pulling him down for another kiss, deeper this time. Her crimson hair fell around them like a curtain as she pressed closer, seeking the warmth and comfort only he could provide. They made love slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies with the same patience they'd used to learn each other's languages. Davin marveled at the way her skin seemed to glow in the shelter's dim light, how her breath hitched when he kissed the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder. Kithara discovered that humans were more fragile than they appeared, but no, less passionate. Afterward, they lay entwined on their narrow bed, her head on his chest, his fingers combing through her hair. "Tomorrow," she said in careful English, "we build you bigger bed." Davin's laughter shook them both. "Tomorrow," he agreed, "we build a bigger bed." Outside, the eternal winds of Arcturus 7 howled across the ice. But inside their small sanctuary, two hearts had found a rhythm that transcended species, war, and the vast emptiness of space. They were no longer just surviving. They were beginning to live. As sleep claimed them, Kithra whispered something in her native tongue. Davin didn't understand the words, but he felt their meaning in the way she held him close. "I choose you." 6 months had transformed their shelter into something resembling a home. Davin had expanded their living space using salvaged hull plating, creating separate areas for sleeping, working, and the small hydroponics garden that now provided fresh vegetables to supplement their dwindling rations. Kithara had woven thermal blankets from fiber optic cables, their surfaces shimmering with captured starlight. But the most profound transformation was in themselves. Kithara no longer flinched when Davin touched her. Instead, she sought out his hands throughout the day, brushing fingers as they worked, resting her palm on his back as he cooked, threading their fingers together as they fell asleep. Her Zephyrian reserve had melted away, replaced by an openness that made Davin's chest tight with wonder. "Tell me about your father," Davin said one evening as they sat before their small fire. He'd learned enough of her language to hold real conversations now, though they still mixed human and Zephyrian words when emotions ran too deep for translation. Kithara's expression grew distant. "Zoreth Keth Nalam," she began, then switched to English. "He is fire and ice, powerful, feared by enemies, beloved by people." She traced patterns in the condensation on their shelter wall. "He thinks I am dead. Do you want to go home?" The question hung between them like a blade. They both knew a distress beacon sat in Davin's pod, functional but unused. One activation would bring rescue and separation. "Home is..." Kithara struggled for the words, then gave up and kissed him instead. Her lips were warm against his, tasting of the spiced tea she'd learned to make from Zephyrian medicinal herbs. When they parted, her violet eyes held galaxies of unshed tears. "Home is where you are." That night their lovemaking carried a desperate edge. Davin worshipped every inch of her pale green skin, from the delicate ridges along her collarbone to the sensitive spots behind her ears that made her gasp his name. Kithara responded with equal fervor, her nails leaving crescents on his shoulders, as she arched beneath him. "Ashkelon Veth Nami," she whispered as they moved together, the ancient Zephyrian words rolling off her tongue like poetry. "What does that mean?" Davin asked, his voice rough with desire. "Heart. Calls to heart." She pulled him deeper, her legs wrapping around his waist. "Souls that find each other across stars." They climaxed together, crying out in languages that suddenly seemed inadequate for what they felt. Afterward, they lay gasping in the aftermath, their bodies slick with sweat despite the cold air around them. Outside their shelter, the aurora of Arcturus 7 painted the sky in impossible colors, ribbons of gold and violet that danced between the distant stars. They watched through their small viewport, Kithara's head pillowed on Davin's chest. "On Zephyria," she said softly, "we have ceremony, when two hearts choose to become one." She lifted her head to meet his eyes. No priests, no politics, just promise between souls. Davin's hand stilled in her hair. "Marriage? More than marriage. Bonding. Until death and beyond death." She sat up, suddenly vulnerable. "But you are human. Maybe for you it is..." "Yes." The word escaped before he could think. Kithara's eyes widened. "Yes? Yes." Davin sat up, cupping her face in his hands. "Whatever ceremony you want, whatever promises you need to hear, yes." They performed the ritual, by firelight, speaking vows in both their languages. Kithara cut a lock of her crimson hair and braided it with a strand of Davin's brown. He carved their names into a piece of metal from her ship, Kithara and Davin, written in human script and Zephyrian symbols intertwined. When they made love again, it was with the solemnity of sacrament. Every touch was a promise, every kiss, a renewal of vows spoken under alien stars. Kithara wept as Davin moved within her, overwhelmed by the completeness of their connection. "Ashkelon Veth Nami," she breathed against his ear. "Heart calls to heart," he repeated in English, finally understanding. They built their own kingdom on that frozen moon, a realm of two, bounded by ice and warmed by love. For 8 months it was enough. They had each other, they had hope, and they had all the time in the universe. Until the morning when Kithara found the working distress beacon hidden beneath Davin's tools, its activation switch worn smooth by the touch of desperate fingers. "How long?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears tracking down her cheeks. Davin couldn't meet her eyes. Since the third week, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the eternal winds of Arcturus 7 began to howl, as if the moon itself mourned the end of their exile. The royal court of Zephyria had not seen such chaos in 3 centuries. Word had spread through the crystalline halls like wildfire. Princess Kithara lived. The daughter presumed dead in the Battle of Epsilon Rift walked among them again. Her crimson hair now worn loose instead of in the elaborate braids of royalty. Her pale green skin marked with scars that spoke of hardship and survival. And beside her walked a human. King Zorith sat frozen upon his obsidian throne, his ancient eyes, the same violet as his daughters, struggling to process what they saw. The princess he had mourned for 2 years approached through the assembled courtiers, her chin raised with familiar defiance. But everything else about her had changed. Gone was the sheltered diplomat who had left on her first peace mission. In her place stood a woman who had learned to fight for what she loved. "Father," Kithara said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. She stopped at the traditional distance from the throne, then deliberately stepped closer. "I have returned, Kithara." The king's voice cracked on her name. He rose slowly, his ceremonial robes rustling like ancient parchment. "My daughter, my heart, we believed you were dead." "I nearly was." She turned slightly, and Davin stepped forward from the shadows where he'd been trying to remain invisible. "This man saved my life. Davin Thorn of Earth." A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the assembled nobles. Several hands moved to ceremonial weapons, though none dared draw them in the throne room. Davin felt their hostile stares like physical weight, but he kept his eyes on King Zorith, whose expression had shifted from joy to something far more complex. "A human," the king said slowly, "in our sacred halls. The human who kept your daughter alive when the universe conspired to kill her," Kithara replied, steel entering her voice. "The man who shared his food when he had barely enough for one, who held me when fever burned through my veins, who built us shelter with his own hands, and who contaminated you with his presence," hissed Chancellor Timon from his position near the throne. The elderly courtier's face twisted with disgust. "My princess, what has this creature done to you? What poison has he whispered in your ears?" Davin tensed, but Kithara's hand found his, a gesture that sent fresh shockwaves through the court. "He taught me what love truly means," she said simply. "Not political alliance or diplomatic necessity, but choice, pure, freely given choice." King Zorith descended from his throne, each step echoing like thunder. When he reached them, he studied, Davin with the intensity of a man reading the future in tea leaves. "You are the enemy," he said quietly. "I was," Davin replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "But I've learned that love makes enemies into something else entirely, and what would that be? Family." The word hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Kithara squeezed Davin's hand, her pulse racing beneath her skin. This was the moment that would determine everything, whether their love could survive the weight of crowns and the expectations of kingdoms. King Zorith stared at the joined hands for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weariness of ages. "Leave us, all of you. I would speak with my daughter, and her companion, alone." The court filed out reluctantly, many casting backward glances filled with curiosity and concern. When the great doors sealed shut, the throne room felt larger and more intimate simultaneously. "Tell me everything," the king commanded. They did. Kithara spoke of the crash, the desperate fight for survival, the slow building of trust between species that had been bred to hate each other. Davin added details, how she'd taught him to repair Zephyrian technology, how they'd created a language that was half human, half alien, entirely their own. "And when rescue came?" Zorith asked. "We chose each other," Kithara said simply. "As we always have." That night, in the quarters assigned to them, notably separate rooms, They found their way to each other despite the guards and protocols. Kythera slipped through hidden passages she'd known since childhood, arriving at Davin's chamber like a ghost in the darkness. "I was afraid," she whispered against his neck as he held her close. "Afraid that seeing this place again would make me remember who I was supposed to be instead of who I chose to become." "And?" Davin's hands tangled in her hair, still amazed that he could touch her, that she was real and warm and his. "I am exactly who I need to be. With you." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "Whatever my father decides, whatever the court demands, I choose you. Always you." Their lovemaking that night carried the urgency of soldiers before battle. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment was both declaration and defiance. When Kythera cried out his name at the peak of pleasure, she didn't care who might hear. Let the court know that she belonged to this human, heart and soul and body. Later, as they lay entwined in sheets that smelled of Zephyrian spices and human soap, Davin traced the scars on her shoulder, the ones he'd helped heal with his own hands. "Your father could have me executed," he said quietly. "He could try." Kythera's voice held the iron that ran in royal bloodlines. "But he would have to go through me first, and I am no longer the sheltered princess who left here 2 years ago." "What are you now?" She smiled, fierce and beautiful and utterly unrepentant. "I am yours, and you are mine. Everything else is just politics." The assassination attempt came at dawn on the 3rd day. Davin woke to the whisper of steel through air and rolled sideways, just as a ceremonial dagger embedded itself in the pillow where his head had been. His attacker, a young Zephyrian noble, with traditional face tattoos, snarled something in the old tongue and lunged again. Years of engineering work had given Davin quick reflexes and strong hands. He caught the noble's wrist, twisted and sent the blade clattering across the floor. What he hadn't expected was for Kythera to appear in the doorway like an avenging spirit, her own weapon drawn and her eyes blazing with royal fury. "Valdris," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Explain yourself." The young noble, barely more than a boy really, fell to his knees. "Princess, he has poisoned you. This human filth has made you forget your pure blood, your sacred duty." "My duty," Kythera interrupted, "is to my people's welfare, not to your outdated prejudices." She kept her blade trained on him as guards finally arrived, summoned by the commotion. "Take him to my father. Let King Zorith decide his fate." As the guards dragged Valdris away, Davin touched the nick on his throat where the dagger had come too close. "How many more like him are there?" "Too many." Kythera's weapon disappeared into the hidden sheath beneath her sleeping gown. "But fewer each day. My father has been persuasive in his private meetings with the noble houses." She was right. Over the past week, King Zorith had systematically dismantled opposition to his daughter's choice through a combination of political maneuvering, veiled threats, and appeals to Zephyrian honor. Those who called Davin a contaminating influence found themselves reminded of human acts of heroism during the war. Those who questioned Kythera's judgment discovered that doing so meant questioning the king's own wisdom in raising such a daughter. The turning point came when Chancellor Thyman, the most vocal opponent of their union, was quietly replaced by his own daughter, who had secretly admired her princess's courage in choosing love over duty. "There will be a ceremony," King Zorith announced to the assembled court on the 10th day. "Not a wedding in the human tradition, not a diplomatic alliance in ours, but something new. A bonding that acknowledges 2 species becoming one family." The ceremony took place in the Crystal Gardens, where bioluminescent flowers created a canopy of living light above the gathered witnesses. Representatives from both human and Zephyrian governments attended, the first such mixing of species in centuries. Kythera wore robes that blended human silk with Zephyrian crystal fiber, their surface shifting between blue and silver as she moved. Davin had been dressed in formal Zephyrian court attire adapted for his human frame, the deep purple fabric making his brown eyes appear almost golden. The vows they spoke were their own creation, drawn from both cultures, but belonging entirely to them. "I choose you," Kythera said, her voice carrying to every corner of the garden. Across the void between stars, beyond the fear between peoples, through whatever storms may come, I choose you, Davin replied. Not because you are princess or alien or other, but because you are yourself. The woman who taught me that love is the only force in the universe stronger than gravity. King Zorith himself performed the binding ritual, weaving cords of human cotton and Zephyrian metal into a single rope that would never break. When he pronounced them bonded, the cheer that rose from the crowd included voices speaking half a dozen languages. That night, in chambers that had been prepared for them as a true couple, they made love with the freedom of knowing they would never again be separated by politics or prejudice. Kithara wept with joy as Davin moved within her, overwhelmed by the knowledge that their love had not only survived the weight of crowns, but transformed it into something beautiful. What happens now? Davin asked, as they lay in the afterglow, her head on his chest, their hearts beating in synchrony. Now we build the bridge, Kithara murmured sleepily. Between our peoples, between the stars, one heart at a time. 5 years later, Ambassador Kithara and her human husband Davin stood on the observation deck of the first joint human-Zephyrian space station, watching ships from both fleets dock side by side. Their daughter, small hands pressed against the viewport, violet eyes wide with wonder, pointed at each vessel and named its planet of origin in the polyglot language that was becoming common among the younger generation. "Look, Mama," little Zara said, using the human word she preferred. "Earthship and Zephyria ship together." "Yes, Starlight," Kithara replied, using the pet name that worked in both languages. Together. Davin wrapped his arms around both of them, marveling at how much the universe had changed since that frozen moon, where they'd first chosen each other. The war was over, replaced by an alliance built on the simple truth they'd discovered in the ice. That love, once kindled, could melt any barrier. In the distance, new ships were arriving. Traders, diplomats, families moving between worlds that were no longer divided by species but united by hope. The kingdom they'd built wasn't made of territory or subjects, but of connections. Heart to heart, world to world, future to future. Heart calls to heart, Kithara whispered against Davin's ear. "Always," he whispered back, and kissed the top of their daughter's head as she continued to count ships and dream of stars yet to be explored. Their love had started as survival and grown into salvation, not just for themselves, but for two species learning to see each other as family rather than enemies. It was, Davin thought, the most important engineering project he'd ever been part of, building bridges strong enough to span the void between worlds,